The wind howled across the Arctic tundra, carrying with it a deadly chill that could freeze skin in seconds. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, an ocean of ice and snow, broken only by jagged ridges and deep, hidden crevasses. A storm was brewing in the distance, the dark clouds rolling in like a predator stalking its prey. If you love heart-wrenching survival stories and moments that restore your faith in humanity, make sure to subscribe to our channel. In the midst of this frozen wasteland, a tiny figure struggled forward, a polar bear cub, no more than a few months old. His fur, meant to be thick and warm, was crusted with ice. His paws, built to walk on ice, wobbled with exhaustion. He had been wandering for days, alone. Somewhere in this endless stretch of white, he had lost his mother. Maybe it was the ice breaking beneath them. Maybe it was a hunter's bullet. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the slow, creeping death of a world melting away beneath their feet. Whatever the reason, he was alone now. And in the Arctic, being alone meant one thing: death. The cub stumbled, his tiny body collapsing into the snow. His breath came in shallow gasps. The cold was relentless, the hunger unbearable. His body was shutting down. He closed his eyes, his small frame disappearing into the blinding white. Then, through the howling wind, footsteps. Not the silent, predatory steps of an Arctic wolf. Not the cautious, prowling movements of a starving adult bear. These were heavier, deliberate, yet hesitant, human footsteps. Miles away, Ethan Carter was pushing forward through the storm. A researcher, a wanderer, a man who had spent the last 5 years documenting the Arctic's vanishing beauty. He had seen the changes, the melting ice, the dying creatures. But never had he expected to stumble upon something like this. At first, he thought it was a trick of the snow, a mound of ice shaped like an animal. But then he saw it, a small rise and fall. Breathing. A cub. Ethan's heart clenched. A lone cub had no chance of survival. He should have been with his mother, learning how to hunt, how to navigate the ice. But he wasn't. He was here, alone, barely alive. Ethan knew he had a choice. He could keep walking. Let nature take its course. Or he could do something insane. The storm raged around him. The cub didn't move. Ethan dropped to his knees and reached out. And in that moment, he made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. Ethan hesitated for only a second before scooping the tiny cub into his arms. The little creature was frighteningly light, his body barely more than bones beneath the thick fur. His breath came in weak, shallow puffs, his eyes closed, as if he had already given up. The researcher tightened his grip around the cub's frozen body, shielding him from the wind. He had seen the brutal reality of the Arctic, he knew that cubs without their mothers didn't survive. But something deep inside him, something primal and unshakable, refused to let this one die. Bracing against the howling wind, Ethan pushed forward toward his base camp. He had set up a temporary shelter in a rock-covered ridge about a mile away, a small, insulated hut where he could document the shifting ice patterns. It wasn't much, but it was warm. And right now, warmth was the only thing that could keep the cub alive. Each step felt like a battle against nature itself. The storm thickened, snow blinding his vision, the cold biting through his layers. But Ethan didn't stop. He clutched the cub tighter, his body shielding the fragile creature from the worst of the storm. By the time he reached his shelter, his fingers were numb, his face burning with frostbite. He kicked the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut against the wind. For a moment, he just stood there, gasping for breath. Then, remembering the cub in his arms, he rushed to the heater. Gently, he set the tiny bear down on a thick blanket, his heart pounding. The cub didn't move. His fur was still frozen, his breaths too weak. Ethan cursed under his breath and scrambled for his supplies. He grabbed a thermal blanket and wrapped it around the cub, rubbing his tiny paws to stimulate circulation. His own fingers tingled with pain as they warmed, but he ignored it. He needed to get the cub's body temperature up, fast. Minutes passed. Ethan kept working, massaging the cub's limbs, speaking softly even though he knew the bear couldn't understand. "Come on, little guy," he murmured. "Don't give up on me." And then, movement. A tiny, barely noticeable twitch of the cub's paw. Then, a shuddering breath. Ethan's heart leaped. He doubled his efforts, rubbing the cub's fur, trying to bring him back from the edge. Slowly, the bear's breathing steadied. His small body relaxed, no longer stiff with cold. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, his eyes fluttered open. For the first time, Ethan found himself staring into the dark, glassy eyes of a wild polar bear cub. A shiver ran through him, not from the cold, but from something else. Something deeper. This was a predator. A creature meant to roam the Arctic, to grow into one of the most powerful hunters on the planet. And yet, in this moment, he was nothing more than a fragile, helpless baby. The cub blinked slowly, his tiny body rising and falling with uneven breaths. And then, to Ethan's complete shock, the bear made a sound, a soft, broken whimper, barely audible over the wind outside. A plea for help. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had traveled to the ends of the earth to study the wild. But never had he expected to become a part of it. And never had he expected a moment like this. The cub remained curled in the blanket, his small body trembling despite the warmth surrounding him. Ethan watched him closely, feeling a strange, unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. He had spent years documenting the Arctic, watching from a distance, recording life through a lens. But now, life was staring back at him, fragile and desperate. The cub's dark eyes flickered open again, hazy and unfocused. He was weak, confused. His tiny nose twitched as he sniffed the air, perhaps expecting the scent of his mother, the warmth of her fur. But there was nothing. Just Ethan. The researcher exhaled slowly, running a hand through his frost-covered beard. He needed to make a plan. The storm outside was worsening, howling against the walls of his shelter. Even if he wanted to return the cub to the wild, he couldn't, not yet. The little one wouldn't survive a minute out there. Ethan moved quickly, grabbing his pack and pulling out a thermos of warm water. He poured some into a shallow dish and set it down near the cub. The bear lifted his head slightly but didn't move. His energy was too far gone. Ethan frowned. He needed something more. Something to keep the cub's strength up. His supplies were limited, just the basics to last his research trip, but then he remembered something. He reached into his bag and pulled out a protein bar. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Breaking it into small pieces, he held one close to the cub's nose. "Come on, buddy," he murmured. "You need to eat." The cub barely reacted. His tiny ears twitched, but his body remained still. Ethan sighed and leaned back. He had no experience raising an animal, especially not a polar bear. He knew that cubs this young relied entirely on their mother's milk. Without it, their chances of survival were slim. But he couldn't let this one die. The storm continued raging outside, shaking the walls. Ethan adjusted the heater, making sure the room stayed warm. Then, hesitating only for a second, he reached out and ran his fingers gently over the cub's fur. It was softer than he expected. Thick, but not yet fully developed. The bear barely reacted, his body limp with exhaustion. Ethan felt something stir in his chest, something he couldn't quite explain. He had spent years studying the Arctic, warning the world about the changes happening here. But in all his time, he had never been this close to the consequences. This cub was a victim of that change. Of the melting ice, the vanishing hunting grounds, the disruption of an entire ecosystem. And now, he was here. Alive. Barely. Ethan wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. He couldn't turn his back on this little survivor. Not now. Not ever. Hours passed, and the storm outside raged on, relentless and unforgiving. The shelter trembled under the force of the Arctic winds, but inside, there was a fragile battle happening, a battle between life and death, between survival and the cold embrace of nature's indifference. Ethan refused to let the cub loose. The little one stirred again, his body still weak but not as lifeless as before. Ethan had managed to get a few drops of warm water into his tiny mouth, and now, for the first time, the cub's nose twitched toward the food. A flicker of hope sparked in Ethan's chest. He broke off another tiny piece of the protein bar and placed it near the cub's mouth. Slowly, shakily, the bear opened his jaw and took it. Relief flooded through Ethan as he watched the cub chew weakly. It wasn't much, but it was something. And something meant hope. Outside, the storm howled, but Ethan barely heard it. His focus was entirely on the small life in front of him. He wrapped the thermal blanket tighter around the cub and adjusted the heater. The warmth was helping, the cub wasn't shivering as much anymore. Ethan leaned back, exhaustion settling in his bones. He hadn't planned for this. His research was supposed to be about documenting climate change, not rescuing wildlife. But looking at the cub now, he knew he couldn't just be an observer anymore. This wasn't just science. This was survival. He reached for his satellite phone, his fingers numb from the cold. He had to contact someone, maybe a wildlife rescue, maybe a research station nearby. But before he could dial, something made him stop. A sound. Low. Deep. A growl. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't coming from the cub. It was coming from outside. His pulse hammered in his ears as he slowly stood up, his heart pounding. He moved toward the small window, wiping away the frost. And then he saw her. A massive shape, barely visible through the blizzard. A towering figure of white against white. A full-grown polar bear. His blood turned to ice. The mother. She had come back. And she was looking for her cub. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The massive bear outside moved like a ghost through the blizzard, her powerful body blending into the storm. But even through the swirling snow, he could see the desperation in her movements, her head low, her paws crunching through the ice with urgency. She was searching. For her cub. Ethan's heart pounded. His instincts screamed at him to stay inside. A mother polar bear was one of the most dangerous creatures in the Arctic. If she caught his scent, if she thought he was a threat, she wouldn't hesitate to attack. But then he looked back at the tiny cub, still curled in the thermal blanket, too weak to move. This was her baby. And he was all she had left. For a brief moment, Ethan was torn between two impossible choices. If he let the cub go outside now, he wouldn't survive in this cold. But if he didn't return him, the mother might never find him. Outside, the bear let out a low, guttural sound, a deep, rolling moan that cut through the wind like a ghost's wail. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was something else. A call. A mother's call. The cub's ears twitched. His tiny body stirred for the first time in hours. Ethan's stomach clenched. The bond between mother and child was stronger than anything in nature. This cub had survived against impossible odds, but without his mother, he wouldn't last much longer. His mind raced. He couldn't just open the door and throw the cub outside. The cold alone would kill him in minutes. He needed a plan. Slowly, he grabbed his thickest jacket and wrapped it around himself. Then, carefully, he picked up the cub, cradling him in his arms. The little one barely reacted, his strength still too far gone. Ethan moved toward the door, hesitating for just a second. Was this suicide? Was he about to step out into the storm and hand-deliver himself to a predator? He had no choice. With a deep breath, he unlatched the door and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall, stealing the breath from his lungs. The wind roared in his ears, and the snow lashed in his face. But Ethan kept his focus on the mother bear. She was closer now, only a few yards away. Her dark eyes locked onto him instantly. Ethan froze. Time stretched. The Arctic wind screamed between them. Then, ever so slowly, Ethan knelt down. He placed the cub gently on the snow, right at the threshold of the shelter. The tiny bear whimpered, his breath weak but warm against the cold. The mother bear didn't move. Ethan could feel the weight of her stare, the sheer power radiating from her massive frame. Every instinct told him to run. To get back inside. But he didn't. Instead, he took a step back. A show of trust. For a long moment, the mother bear remained still. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she moved forward. Her paws sank deep into the snow, her breath visible in the freezing air. Ethan didn't move. Didn't blink. Then, finally, she reached her cub. The little one let out a faint, pitiful sound. And the mother bear responded. A deep, rumbling noise that was almost soft. A sound Ethan had never heard from a predator before. Carefully, she nudged the cub with her massive snout, sniffing him, checking him. Ethan felt something in his chest tighten. It was a reunion on the edge of life and death, silent, powerful, and unbearably fragile. For a moment, it seemed like the storm had disappeared. Then, without warning, the mother bear turned her gaze back to Ethan. And took a step toward him. His pulse spiked. Every nerve in his body screamed danger. But then, something impossible happened. She lowered her head. Not in a gesture of aggression. But of understanding. A silent acknowledgement. And then, just like that, she turned away. She lifted her cub gently by the scruff of his neck and carried him into the storm, vanishing into the endless white. Ethan stood there, breathless, his heart hammering against his ribs. Had that really just happened? Had a wild polar bear just trusted him? The storm raged on, but for the first time, Ethan didn't feel its cold. He felt something else. Something warmer than any fire. Something deeper than any survival instinct. A connection. One he would never forget. Ethan stood frozen, staring into the storm long after the mother bear and her cub had vanished. The wind howled around him, biting through his layers, but his mind was too overwhelmed to register the cold. Had he really just witnessed that? Had a mother polar bear, a wild predator, recognized his actions, acknowledged him, and left in peace? It defied everything he knew about survival in the Arctic. Slowly, he backed into the shelter and shut the door, leaning against it as the weight of the moment settled in. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. This wasn't just another wildlife encounter. This was something bigger. Ethan's fingers trembled as he reached for his camera. He had documented the cub's condition, the storm, and even glimpses of the mother through the blizzard, but had he captured enough? Would anyone believe him? He rewound the footage, his pulse quickening as the images played back. The cub, barely alive. The storm raging outside. And then, through the whiteout, the shadow of the mother bear emerging. But the moment that sent shivers down his spine wasn't when she had taken her cub. It was when she had looked at him. A silent moment of trust. A wild, untamed predator, one of the Arctic's deadliest hunters, had met his gaze and chosen peace. Ethan let out a slow breath. This was the kind of story the world needed to hear. He turned on his satellite phone, praying for a connection. The signal flickered weakly, but after a few tries, he managed to send out a message to his research team. "You won't believe what just happened. I have footage. This changes everything." But as he sat there, staring at the dim glow of the screen, another thought began to creep in. The mother bear had found her cub this time. But how many others wouldn't be so lucky? Ethan had spent years studying climate change, documenting statistics, ice measurements, and migration patterns. But today, in the middle of a blizzard, he had felt its impact in a way he never had before. The cub had been starving. His mother had been searching for food in the wrong place, too close to human settlements, too far from where the ice should have been. This wasn't just a heartwarming story of survival. It was a warning. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had always been a researcher, an observer, but maybe it was time to be something more. Maybe it was time to be a voice. He turned his camera toward himself, pressed record, and spoke into the lens. "This is Ethan Cole, reporting from the Arctic Circle. I just witnessed something that shook me to my core. A polar bear cub, starving, abandoned in a storm, found his way to my shelter. Against all odds, he survived. His mother found him. But the truth is, they might not be so lucky next time. He exhaled, his breath visible in the freezing air. This is happening because of us. The ice is vanishing. Their home is disappearing. And if we don't act now, we'll lose them forever. His voice was steady, but inside, he felt the weight of those words. The world needed to see what he had seen today. Because maybe, just maybe, if enough people cared, the next polar bear cub wouldn't have to be found alone in the snow. Ethan uploaded the footage as soon as he got a stable connection. It wasn't just a video, it was a message, a plea, a story that had to be told. He watched as the file transferred, knowing this moment could change everything. Days passed, and as he waited for a response, he couldn't shake the image of the mother bear and her cub from his mind. Did they survive? Did she find enough food? Or had he just delayed the inevitable? Then, something extraordinary happened. His phone buzzed, a weak signal, but enough for a flood of notifications. At first, it was just a few emails. Then, hundreds. The video had gone viral. Major news networks were reaching out. Conservationists, climate scientists, and even ordinary people from around the world were sharing it. Comments poured in, people were shocked, moved, inspired. I had no idea polar bears were struggling like this. This broke my heart. What can we do to help? We need to do something before it's too late. Ethan scrolled, barely believing what he was seeing. The story had struck a nerve. It was no longer just an Arctic researcher's experience, it was a global conversation. Then, a message popped up that made his breath catch. Dr. Cole, we need to talk. Let's change the world together. It was from a major wildlife foundation. Ethan stared at the screen, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. He had spent years documenting the Arctic, studying the decline, warning people. But for the first time, he felt something different. Hope. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was the beginning of something bigger. Outside, the Arctic winds howled, whispering through the endless white. Somewhere, out in the vast frozen wilderness, a mother bear and her cub were fighting to survive. And now, maybe, just maybe, they had a chance.